Sir, please. It's raining, and she can't move her chair. Ronan's voice cracked through the dark. Empty street as thunder rolled overhead. The garage had been closed for hours, its neon sign flickering in the storm. But there she was, an old woman, drenched to the bone, her groceries spilled across the curb, and her wheelchair frozen in place. Every passing car ignored her. Every window stayed shut. Ronan looked back at the locked garage door. He wasn't supposed to open it after hours. Company policy was clear. No exceptions, no charity work, no freebies. But how could he just walk away? He dropped his toolbox beside her and knelt down. "Ma'am, don't worry. I got you." She gave a faint, embarrassed smile. "You shouldn't—" "It's late. I'll be fine." Ronan shook his head. "Not tonight, you won't." The rain pounded harder as he pried open the wheelchair's frame, his hands working by instinct. Years of fixing engines, brakes, and broken metal had taught him one thing. If something's broken, you fix it. Rules or not. Inside the garage, the fluorescent lights buzzed weakly. He dragged her chair inside, careful not to make noise that could trigger the security alarm. Water dripped from his jacket as he soldered wires, tightened bolts, and replaced the damaged gear using one of his own spare parts, one he'd bought with his paycheck last week. The old woman watched quietly, her frail hands trembling as she whispered, "How much do I owe you?" Ronan looked up with a tired smile. "Nothing. Just promise me you'll get home safe." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that came from surprise and gratitude. "No one's ever done something like this for me before." Ronan helped her back into the chair and rolled her out into the night. The motor hummed back to life, smooth and steady. She turned once before leaving and said, "God bless you, son." He nodded, closing the garage door behind her, unaware that the security camera above had captured every second of it. The next morning, sunlight replaced the storm, but peace didn't last long. Ronan stood in front of his boss's office, water still dripping from his boots. Wade Pritchard, the shop owner, leaned back in his leather chair, a cold smirk cutting across his face. "You open my shop after hours?" Wade said, his tone almost amused. "She needed help, sir. The chair was—" "Stop." Wade raised a hand. "You use my tools, my lights, and my parts for a stranger who didn't even pay you?" Ronan's silence said everything. Wade chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're a mechanic, not a charity worker." The room went quiet. The other workers outside pretended not to hear, but every ear was listening. Wade leaned forward. "Pack your things. You're done here." The words hit harder than the storm. Ronan stared at him, disbelief, anger, and hurt swirling in his chest. "You're firing me." "For helping someone?" Wade shrugged. "Rules are rules." Outside, Ronan walked past the other mechanics who couldn't meet his eyes. He carried his old toolbox, the same one that had once built dreams, now holding the pieces of a ruined job. By the time he reached home, the world already felt colder. But deep down, he knew he'd do it all again if he had to, because some rules weren't made to protect people. They were made to protect pride. That night, Ronan sat alone on his porch, staring at the rain starting again. He didn't know it yet, but far away, someone had already seen that security footage. And by morning, the world would know his name. "Get out of my shop, Ronan. You're done." The words landed like a hammer on steel. Every mechanic froze mid-motion. Tools stopped clanking. Engines went silent. Only Wade Pritchard's voice echoed across the garage, sharp, cruel, and echoing authority. Ronan stood still, grease on his hands, disbelief in his eyes. "Sir, you can't be serious." "I just helped a woman in need." Wade smirked, leaning against a polished red Mustang like a king on his throne. "Oh, I'm dead serious. You broke company policy. You opened my shop after hours. You used my tools, my power, my parts. For free." A couple of workers glanced at each other, uncomfortable. One whispered, "He was just helping a grandma." Wade snapped his head toward them. "You got something to say?" Silence. Heads dropped. Ronan took a breath, steady but hurt. "You always told us this shop runs on reputation, Wade. What do you think people would say if they knew you fired a man for helping someone?" Wade laughed, cold, mocking. "People don't care about kindness. They care about money. And you just cost me both. He tossed a paper envelope across the counter. Your final paycheck. Now leave before I call security. Ronan's chest tightened. Years of loyalty, dedication, and overtime, all gone in one moment. He picked up his toolbox, the same one his father had given him, and walked out. Every step felt heavier than the last. Behind him, Wade's voice followed like poison. And don't think you'll get another job in this town. Mechanics are replaceable. Saints aren't profitable. By the time Ronan stepped outside, the midday sun burned against his face. His co-workers stood by the window watching silently. No one spoke. No one dared. That evening, word began to spread. First among employees, then customers, then the whole town. Did you hear about that mechanic who got fired for helping an old lady? Man, that's cold. Someone said there's security footage, and when that footage hit the internet, it exploded. Ronan's quiet act of compassion, repairing a broken wheelchair in the rain, became the spark that lit a wildfire. By morning, hashtags filled every feed. The mechanic with a heart. Fired for kindness people from across the country began calling, messaging, tagging. And Wade Pritchard's auto shop, once the pride of the street, was now being torn apart in the comments section. As Ronan sat in his small kitchen, unaware of how far the story had spread, his phone buzzed with hundreds of notifications. But he didn't touch it. He just stared at his calloused hands, the same hands that had done what was right, because in his heart, he still believed one thing. Even if the world punishes you for kindness, it's still worth doing, but by sunrise he would learn, kindness doesn't just echo. Sometimes it roars back louder than anyone expects. Sir, that's him. The mechanic everyone's talking about. Ronan froze mid-step as two teenagers pointed their phones at him outside the grocery store. Cameras flashed. People whispered his name like it was suddenly famous. He didn't understand. He'd only done what anyone should do. Back at his small apartment, his neighbor Mia burst through the door holding her phone. Ronan, you're all over the internet. He frowned. What are you talking about? She turned the screen toward him. The video, grainy, captured from the garage's security camera, showed him kneeling in the rain, fixing an elderly woman's wheelchair, his jacket draped over her shoulders. The caption read, "Mechanic fired for kindness." Within hours, it had millions of views, thousands of comments, people calling him the mechanic with a heart. He sat there, speechless, watching strangers from all over the world defend him. Some offered donations. Others called for his boss to be fired instead. News anchors debated the story on national TV. Meanwhile, Wade Pritchard's auto shop was in chaos. Customers canceled appointments. Reporters gathered outside the gate. One employee told a friend, Wade's losing his mind. He didn't see this coming. But for Ronan, fame felt heavier than the silence that followed. His phone buzzed nonstop, yet his heart was still bruised. I didn't do it for cameras, he whispered. I just couldn't leave her there. That night, as rain tapped softly against the window, he replayed everything in his mind. The old woman's trembling hands, her tearful smile, her words before leaving. You're a good man, son. The world needs more like you. He didn't know her name. Didn't know she was anyone important. To him, she was just someone who needed help. But outside, far away in a city skyline filled with glass towers and power, someone else was watching that same video, again and again. A woman in a wheelchair. And beside her, a man in a tailored suit who leaned forward and said quietly, Find him. Ronan had no idea. The woman he helped wasn't just a stranger. She was Ethel Branson, and her son was one of the most powerful men in the country. And by morning, 7 black SUVs would be on their way to his front door. The rumble started before sunrise. Deep, heavy, and wrong. Ronan sat up in bed, heart pounding, as headlights poured through his curtains like floodlights. Outside, 7 black SUVs blocked his driveway. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds, whispering. Someone muttered, He's being arrested. Another gasped, I knew it! Those government cars! Ronan's mind raced. Had Wade pressed charges? Was this about the shop? He stepped outside slowly, barefoot, the cold air biting his skin. A man in a dark suit stepped out from the lead SUV, flanked by two others. No uniforms. Just quiet power. Ronan Avery? The man asked. Ronan's voice cracked. Yeah, that's me. What's going on? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the rear door. Inside, an elderly woman smiled softly, the same woman whose wheelchair he'd fixed. Mrs. Branson? Ronan whispered, disbelief flooding his face. She laughed gently. You didn't think I'd forget you, did you? Behind her sat her son, Richard Branson, Jr., one of the state's most powerful businessmen. He leaned forward, eyes sharp but kind. You helped my mother when no one else would, he said. And you paid for it with your job. That doesn't sit right with me. Ronan blinked, struggling to process. I wasn't expecting— Good, Richard interrupted. Then this'll surprise you. He handed Ronan a thick envelope. Inside are two things, your full back pay and a job offer, a real one. Ronan froze. A job? With you? Richard smiled. With us. My company runs a foundation that restores mobility equipment for veterans and seniors. We could use someone who actually cares. The street was silent except for the sound of wind and the click of cameras. Neighbors filming, jaws hanging open. Ronan looked at the SUVs, at the powerful people standing before him, and then at the woman in the back seat, smiling like a proud grandmother. He exhaled shakily. I don't know what to say. Mrs. Branson's voice was soft but firm. Just say yes, dear. The world needs more hands like yours. The man who'd been fired for kindness now stood in his driveway, jobless no more. His life about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. But as the SUVs drove away, Wade Pritchard watched from a distance, jaw tight, eyes burning with jealousy, and that was only the beginning. Did you hear? Wade's being investigated. The rumor hit the town like lightning. One whisper turned into a storm. And by noon, the man who once barked orders was suddenly the talk of every diner, gas station, and bar in Augusta. Wade Pritchard, the boss who fired Ronan for helping an old woman, was now being accused of pocketing customer payments, faking invoices and using company funds for his weekend getaways. Inside the shop, his empire was collapsing. Mechanics who once flinched at his voice now watched in silence as two men in suits walked past them, flashing badges. Mr. Pritchard, one of them said flatly, we need to have a word. Wade tried to play it cool. Look, this must be some kind of mistake. I've been running this place for 15 years. The agent didn't blink. Then you should have known better than to bill the state for phantom repairs. A hush fell. One of the mechanics, the same man Wade had humiliated the day he fired Ronan, muttered under his breath, Karma doesn't miss. Wade spun around, furious. You think this is funny? But no one answered. Not one mechanic lifted their head. The man who once ruled with fear now stood completely alone. Outside, reporters had gathered, cameras flashing as Wade was led out of the garage in handcuffs. The same lot where he'd fired a good man now became his walk of shame. The irony burned deeper than the cuffs biting his wrists. He could hear the whispers. That's what you get for firing the good one. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, Ronan was fixing a broken wheelchair at his new workshop, the one Mrs. Branson's foundation had funded. He didn't even know the full story yet. All he heard was the faint sound of sirens echoing through the morning air. He paused for a second, looked up, and whispered, Guess some things fix themselves. And as Wade's SUV disappeared behind flashing red and blue lights, Augusta's townsfolk realized something. Justice didn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wore grease-stained hands and a quiet smile. Mr. Avery, you don't know what you've done for me. The old woman's voice trembled as she spoke. Her hands rested on the armrest of the repaired wheelchair, gleaming in the morning light. For a second, Ronan couldn't answer. Not because he didn't have words, but because her gratitude hit him harder than anything he'd felt in weeks. Just a few days ago, that same act of kindness had cost him his job, his reputation, and nearly his faith in people. But today, standing in that quiet yard, watching the old woman roll forward with ease, it suddenly all made sense. She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "They told me no one fixes these anymore. Said it'd cost too much, but you didn't even ask for a dime." Ronan smiled faintly. "Ma'am, some things don't need a price tag." Behind her, two neighbors watched from their porches, the same ones who'd once whispered about that mechanic who got fired. But now their expressions had changed. Shame, maybe. Admiration, even. The woman wheeled closer, her hand shaking as she reached into her coat pocket. "I want you to have this." Inside was a small folded envelope. Ronan tried to refuse, but she pushed it into his palm anyway. "It's not money," she said softly. "It's a thank you, from someone who still believes good men deserve better." Ronan opened it later, once she'd gone inside. Inside was a handwritten note, simple, elegant, and trembling with sincerity. It read, "You fixed more than a chair. You fix my hope in people." He stood there for a long moment, letting the words sink in. Then he noticed something else tucked behind the note. A small card embossed with a logo, Branson Foundation for Community Heroes. On the back, a message. "We'd like to meet you, Mr. Avery." His heart froze. The very act that got him fired was now opening a door he never saw coming. He looked at the sky, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion. "Guess it's true," he murmured. Kindness always finds its way back. But what Ronan didn't know was that this note wasn't just a thank you. It was the start of something much bigger, something that would make the whole town. Remember his name,